Hey, welcome everybody. I know some folks will trickle in, but we're going to get going. We want to give Dr. Drew Hart all the time we can. My name's Shane. It's good to see all of you. And I know we're kind of still getting going, getting up a little bit. And I brought Drew a little present, but I brought you one too. We started this new line of shirts called For Such a Time as This. And they're produced in our neighborhood. But this one says, "What if Jesus meant the stuff he said?" And on the back, it's got the whole Sermon on the Mount. So this is for, I think it's a large or something, so you can share that there. By the way, if you want your own, you can get it off thesimpleway.org. But I brought Drew one. This is one of our special ones. I thought you would really vibe with this one, Drew. It's got the official flag code is you can fly the flag upside down in times of dire distress. So this says distress, and it's got the flag on it for you there, brother. So this is the second in our series, the Red Letter Christian series of Windows of the World. And we're bringing in speakers, all of them friends, people who have a really beautiful message that are connecting Jesus and justice in real concrete ways in the world that we live in. And so these are also going to be available online for folks that couldn't make it. Some of you that came that might not be students, there's a lunch kind of dialogue with Drew afterwards. It's $5, all you can eat. And if you're a student, obviously you're very welcome. But everyone's welcome to the Q&A. He's going to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end of this session too, but let me introduce him. So Drew is a professor of theology at Messiah. He attended Messiah. He did his Master's of Divinity at Biblical Theological Seminary, did his PhD work at Lutheran Theological Seminary. He's really got a pastoral heart. He's been a pastor and done all kinds of anti-racism work and different work over the last decade. His book, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, is incredible, and it's also available outside after the session this morning. So he's on Twitter. He's an incredible voice in the church today. So welcome our brother Drew Hart.
Thanks, Shane, and I'm just a pleasure to be here and to join you all. I'm always pleased when people come out to actually have conversations on racism. These days, those are the things where people often are trying to opt out of and avoid at all costs. And so the fact that we can come together and have some really important conversations around race and racism in the church that are going to help us expand and hopefully have better frameworks for dealing with what's going on in our society is really important. I actually get opportunities to speak to folks both in big groups, but also one-on-one on race frequently. And so I periodically have had pastors in the Philadelphia area especially reach out to me and ask if they could get together and have a conversation. And on one particular occasion, there was a pastor who was from the suburbs of Philadelphia who reached out and asked if we could meet, and so I agreed. And so it was like a summer day, a hot summer day, and we met halfway in the middle of the afternoon at a McDonald's. And there we were, and we began sharing our stories, and we began to realize that we knew some common folks and had some common experiences, and really were connecting and sharing our own personal stories and kind of what brought us to those points. And then partway through the conversation, my pastor friend, we had these sweet tea cups. Y'all know the sweet tea cups from McDonald's. I always brag on those things because they're terrible for you. But you had a real, I'm sure Shane can appreciate a real sweet tea, where the sugar's gritting through your teeth. You're getting like a cavity as you're drinking it, and you're enjoying it anyway. And so that's kind of what we were doing this particular afternoon, trying to just stay cool. And so he grabs one of these, the styrofoam sweet tea cups, and he puts it in between us, and he said, "Drew, you see this cup? You see, on one side of the cup, there's a logo, and on the other side of the cup, there's some writing. And I can't see what's on your side of the cup, and you can't see what's on my side of the cup. And so you need me to help you understand what's going on your side, on my side of the cup, and I need you to help see what's on your side of the cup. And I was like, oh, we're having like a little PBS moment. And so he went on about how, we just need to hear and swap stories and how important that was. And I was kind of moved. I was like, oh, that was really a really nice sentiment. But then I stopped him. I said, but that's not how things work. That's nice, but that's not how the real world works. I said, I already know what's on your side of the cup. I've always known. I said, I grew up even in black neighborhoods. I had mostly white teachers, had to learn Eurocentric history and literature. As I went off to college, I went to a white Christian college where I was immersed I was the only person of color on my floor. I had to navigate that space. As I went on and did my graduate work and PhD work, I had to not only learn the classics and all that stuff, but I had to understand as I spoke and engage, to understand what people were thinking as I spoke, and how they were perceiving me and my body in front of them. And so I've always had to navigate and try to think about white dominant culture, white dominant history, English, literature, music. I've just been swarmed with it. In fact, I couldn't do the work that I do today had I not done those things. But I said, and I challenged him because he was, he's an InterVarsity Press author and all this. I said, look, you can go your whole life and never step foot in a black community. You can go your whole life, not learn about black intellectual thought, literature, history, music, traditions. And you can do that and you will still be successful. And so that what we're talking about here isn't just a cultural program, interchange, swap of cultures back and forth. What we're talking about here is that we need to identify the power dynamics that interfere and shape even small little conversations like what we're having right now. And I think for him, he was a little caught off guard a little bit, but I think he began to understand that, it's not good enough to just have a cultural exchange if we're not going to go a little bit deeper and consider the power dynamics that shape our whole entire society. And so I think that's important for us, even as we dare to have conversations around race and racism in the church, that we got to begin to be very serious about the kind of power dynamics that are at play in our society. Now, I can remember as a Messiah alum, I imagine I have some similar memories and experiences as maybe some folks here at Eastern. And so not quite a few times I'd find myself in rooms like this, listening to speakers. And I have two particular chapel experiences. This isn't a chapel per se, but I have two particular chapel experiences that I have never forgotten. Like they just kind of stick in my mind. One particular chapel was a couple years after 9/11 took place. And so if you can remember, well, I guess many of you were very young at that time, but the climate was thick. And we were embedded in all kinds of wars. And we had a speaker by the name of John Deere, who I had no idea who he was at the time when he was coming. And he came to speak, and he began speaking on the Sermon on the Mount, and called us to be peacemakers and to take seriously the Sermon on the Mount and to love our enemies. And then he began to extend that and talk about the militarism that we were involved in and this eagerness for war that we were ready for. And just he actually critiqued Bush, the country, militarism, all kinds of stuff. And, for me, I was a little surprised. I didn't grow up in a church that talked about peace too often. And so, this was a little bit different for me. I was still trying to make sense of what I thought about what he was saying. But he was teaching Jesus. He was teaching the teachings of Jesus. He centered it in Jesus. And then he was connecting it to the implications of what was going on in our society. And so I decided I was going to kind of lean in because, I love Jesus. I want to at least lean in. And so I began to lean in and try to receive and try to understand where he was coming from and what he was trying to say. And right as I began to lean in this big, dark auditorium, probably a couple thousand students there, I began to notice a commotion. And before I knew it, I realized that there was this huge exodus taking place. Hundreds and hundreds of students were in the middle of his talk, getting up, stomping out, and heading out of the auditorium. Hundreds, not a couple, not five, hundreds. And I was kind of intrigued by that moment, and that's one of the reasons why I've never forgotten that moment, because I was so intrigued. I mean, I understand that he preached Jesus in a way that subverted and made us uncomfortable, but I was so surprised that so many of my peers would cling so much to their Americanness that they couldn't even wrestle with the teachings of Jesus, that they shut down, that they turned off, that so deeply were their Christianity and their American exceptionalist ideas intertwined together that they couldn't even hear the Sermon on the Mount anymore. That was one experience. My second one, we used to have these multicultural chapels on campus back in the day that we called Culture Shock. It was a student of color-led chapel. And this one particular day, I can't even remember the speaker's name, but we had a young black man, and he came and he began speaking and talking about the God of the oppressed, right? This God that had always been on the side of the oppressed, took sides with Israelites when they were poor and oppressed and enslaved, but when they began exploiting others, he sent his prophets to speak against them. And then we see this Jesus who was revealed, who said that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so he pointed out to the fact that God has always been a God liberating and taking sides with those who are most vulnerable in our society. And then he began to connect that with our American society, and particularly the history of race. And he talked about slavery and Jim Crow and black codes and convict leasing systems and the sharecropping systems and the 5,000 black men, women, and children that were lynched post-slavery, all the way up to the present day, and the school-to-prison pipeline, and all the different things that were impacting our current society today. Now, I grew up in a black church, so it wasn't like completely new for me to hear someone talk about race in the church per se, but he was kind of speaking on a different register than the way it normally was. Like, he was just kind of speaking unadulterated truth. And so once again, I was like, wow, this guy is speaking some truth, and he's connecting and telling this story of Israel and God revealed in Jesus Christ. And so I decided I was going to lean in again. So I started leaning in here in this multicultural chapel, mostly minority students, underrepresented students in the room, but there were some white students in the room as well. And as I began leaning in, I noticed some commotion again. This time the commotion was a little bit smaller because this was an alternative optional chapel. And so there weren't as many students there to begin with, but many of the white students who were in the room got up and left. They were very frustrated because he was talking about white supremacy, and he was talking about race and the history of how racist America was, and it was very uncomfortable for a lot of them. And so I was intrigued once again because they seemed to cling once again, well, in this case, to their white identity, I think, and were not willing to wrestle with the hard realities of the gospel of Jesus Christ and its implications for our society today. And so I saw how deeply in our society our Christian formation has been so deeply intertwined and entangled with American exceptionalism and white supremacy, I would say, in such a way that it actually cripples a possibility of having a Jesus-shaped imagination that can speak into the challenges that we face in our society. When we talk about thinking through race and racism in our society and having actually meaningful conversations, one of the challenges, I think, especially in the church, is that we don't even clarify what we mean when we say race and racism. And so sometimes we're just talking past each other. We're using the same words and people are meaning two different things. I've often noticed that often, some people are operating out of what I call the dictionary definition and what I call the sociological definition, right? So I call the dictionary definition is kind of like the common definition that most people think of when they hear the word racism. And probably in most cases, not always, but in most cases, it's probably the first definition you'll find in many dictionaries, right? And it's this kind of I call it a narrow, thin definition of racism that's solely about an individual having prejudice or hatred towards another individual, right? And I often mention, since, people are like, well, it's in the dictionary, so what does that mean? I'm like, well, so is selfie, and Google is a verb now, you can thank my generation for all those contributions. But often, dictionaries just reflect the way that we use language, not necessarily the best way to use language. And so just because it's the first definition just means that it's prominent in how we use the language and not necessarily the best way to use it. And so it's a very thin definition that solely is looking at personal prejudice and matters of the heart and intent, which often are things that nobody can see, prove. It's not tangible, it's not concrete, right? And so it's just kind of things that we can just debate about endlessly. But if you were to go into a sociology department, especially if you were to engage someone who maybe does critical race studies, you're going to have a much more robust definition of racism. You're going to have a systemic framework for racism. They're going to talk about the widespread patterns, the way that racism has organized our society, has structured our society by race, right? And so it's a different way of approaching it, this wide framework, and it's explaining and thinking about how did race come to be in the way that it is today? How did it develop? Understand that it's a social construct that's doing social and political work in our society. It does something, right? It's just not a neutral category. It's not just an actual biological trait of difference. These are terms and categories that we constructed to do social and political work, to help to organize and justify the way that we've organized our society for the last 400 years. And so when we move from a thin definition to a thicker definition of racism, then all of a sudden we can kind of approach and engage and see more, I think, in terms of what we're talking about. Because I think if we just keep to this narrow definition, we kind of miss the point. And sometimes what ends up happening is that we just start scapegoating people as the bad people, right? We try to figure out who the bad people are and who the good people are, right? That's the bad racists, those alt-right folks, they're the bad ones, right? The rest of us, we're pretty good, right? And well, within that thin definition, you can get away with that because you can kind of manipulate it and stuff like that. But when you begin to have a broader framework, then you begin to see that we're all participating in a racialized society. Every last one of us are participating in a racialized society and have to then figure out, how are we participating in it? Are we actively bolstering it? Are we passively going along with it? Are we resisting it? How are we operating in this racialized system? I often remember how Paula Deen was treated after she had said all those, really offensive, prejudicial comments. She wanted to have a slave kind of wedding and use N-word. It was all kinds of stuff. And then she had this really awkward apology like celebrities always do. And I remember afterwards, how everybody responded, like everybody all across the board. It was like, ooh, bad Paula Deen. Ooh, racist. You're bad Paula Deen. And I for a moment, I kind of felt, yeah, bad. Then I was like, wait a minute, like, what are we doing here? Like, it's so easy to try to scapegoat racism into like Paula Deen, but like Paula Deen did not create racism. She was not up in a lab somewhere like, I'm going to cook up something really good for you all. I got something for you, right? No, she's not that slick. She really isn't. Paula Deen, she's a human being that was socialized by communities, by people, by a long history, 400 years of white supremacist history. And so she didn't drop out of a vacuum. She participated in a society that could produce people who think like Paula Deen, right? And so if we step back and stop trying to scapegoat individuals and begin to take note of this larger system, I think we have a much better way of understanding what's going on in the racial character of the society that we live in today. But one of the real challenges, I think, for having these kind of conversations that can really confront white supremacy and meaningfully get somewheres is that what emerged in the context after the civil rights of kind of talking about racism is the emergence of colorblind ideology. Right? Now, theoretically, if you look at the history of it, technically it actually emerged initially in the black community, who would want to commit to the idea that all of us are human beings and need to see our humanity, right? And so how do we see, and not just see color, but see people's actual humanity? And that was an idea that, I mean, you could go back to like Richard Allen and all kinds of early Christians who would say those kind of things. But what happens post-civil rights is people latched on to Dr. King's one phrase from his sermon, right? To not judge anyone by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. People latched on to that, flipped it on its head, and used it in reverse. Right? And so now what happens is that people, sometimes good meaning, and sometimes I think for not great reasons, use the language to justify not dealing with racism, to not acknowledging what's going on. So now the very logics, the very rhetoric that was used at one time to address racism and try to humanize and see other people in their full humanity is now used as a mechanism, as a tool, as a technology to avoid talking about racism altogether. And so I'm sure we've all heard folks say, oh, I'm just colorblind. I don't see color. Like, you don't see color. Who here does not know that I'm a black man? Come on, like, it doesn't make any sense, and we know that it's illogical, and we know it's not true, and we know that in our highly racialized society, we all recognize very quickly race, right, as an identifier, as a category, as we engage with other people. And so it's not true. But more importantly, the problem is that then it's actually doing the opposite. It's forcing us to not engage with the realities around our society. In fact, many researchers have found that many of the folks who are most persistent in colorblind ideology live some of the most racialized lives. So there's this deep contradiction going on between, I don't see race, but I live in an all-white neighborhood, have all-white friends, all-white social networks, go to all-white church, shop at all-white stores, read all-white authors, right? You can look at somebody's bookshelf, you need all-white author, everything, right? Their whole world is extremely racialized in character, and yet they're committed to this idea of colorblind ideology. And so what I end up saying is, well, it doesn't seem like it's not color that you don't see, it's that racism is what you're not seeing, right? You're not seeing the racial structures of our society and of one's own life. And so I think there's a lot of honesty that we need to move beyond just this kind of easy rhetoric that kind of pushes aside and makes it seem like the people talking about race are the troublemakers, right? I mean, that's what they did with Dr. King, right? He would come to town and say, oh, these outside agitators stirring up all this trouble. Our Negroes were just fine until y'all showed up, right? And so there's this long history of thinking that if we avoid the subjects, if we talk about it less, that somehow that's going to make things better. And of course, that's never been the case historically in the past, nor now in the present. I think one of the most important things that we need to begin to understand as we talk about race and racism in the church is to be honest about what we mean, and that these aren't just, again, just neutral categories, but that embedded within the idea of race itself is this idea of racial hierarchy and what we could also call white supremacy. Now, I know when people hear the word white supremacy, people start freaking out like, whoa, that's a little heavy, right? You know, I mean, isn't that what the neo-Nazis and the skinheads and the KKK are? And now this alt-right, supposedly whatever they are, right? That's white supremacy. But I want us to begin to challenge how we use that language as though, again, we can kind of limit it to that rather than thinking about the broader character of who America has been, is, and probably will be for a long time. You know, back in the 40s, there were some experiments called the Clark-Dahl experiments. Anybody familiar? I'm sure some students at least are probably maybe reading that in class. And so the Clark-Dahl experiments were in the 1940s. In fact, they were pretty significant in as research that they brought in terms of desegregating the schools. They used that as one of the arguments. But what they did was that they would take one black child or one white child at a time, and they would sit them before a black doll and a white doll, and they'd ask them a series of questions. Which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the beautiful doll? Which doll is the ugly doll? And they would go forth and ask all these sorts of questions. And we're not surprised by mostly white kids in the 1940s and some of the answers that they gave, because they mostly assumed that everything white was good and everything black was bad, right? And so we're not really surprised. Nobody actually references this research because of that particular those responses. What struck people more was the black children's responses. The black children's responses are what kind of took people a bit by surprise. You know, often in our society, we talk a lot, people talk a lot about reverse racism, right? Reverse racism. No, that's reverse. You flipped it on its head. Now you're engaging in reverse racism. That's the real problem. And so I imagine that maybe they thought that that would have also been the case, right? That's what they were going to see. But when they asked these black children a series of same questions with a white doll and a black doll, which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the ugly doll? Which doll is the beautiful doll? Over and over again, the black children pointed to the white doll as good and beautiful, and to the black dolls as ugly and bad. And then they would ask them, you know, which doll looks most like you? And right after they've given all these negative attributes to this black doll, they point to the black doll. You see, they were all human beings internalizing the same racial ideology, the same white supremacist system, right? We were all human beings walking on this earth, and the prevailing hegemonic, dominant ideology and sentiment and racist framework, everybody was vulnerable to internalizing that. Now, of course, the white kids had internalized it to different degrees, maybe than some of the black kids, but it was pervasive all throughout society, right? Now, of course, we're like, well, that was the 1940s. I mean, this is the 21st century. We've moved on. We're post-racial now. We're way beyond those things. But of course, you know, this particular study has actually been, because it's been so interesting, people have reduplicated it with all kinds of different variables, and sometimes, you know, not just black, white, but space for brown and all the different colors, and trying to kind of reproduce with more advanced, you know, methods. And what they're finding still, even today, is that there's just a high level of both black and white children that are internalizing what we can call racial hierarchy or white supremacy, right? And what we're talking about when we say white supremacy then isn't just the ideology of KKK people, it's just the norming and overvaluing of whiteness itself, right? White Eurocentric standards of beauty and worth, innocence and goodness, right? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about white supremacy, how that racial hierarchy system, that within that system embeds this kind of permanent anti-black sentiment that's a part of the system itself. That whiteness was created as an oppositional character to not only black people, but then to other people of color as well. And then we've got to think about what whiteness is. And how did that come to be, and how does that shape people's everyday lives? Because if we just think of it as a passive thing, right? Sometimes we just have, oh, white privilege. People just have white privilege, right? And it just sounds like this passive thing that just happened somehow, and people just walk with and they're just stuck with, right? But whiteness was a choice. It was a choice. Europeans chose whiteness. There was a time when white people did not think of themselves as white. German, Irish, whatever, but you weren't white. And people first, I mean, you could say the skeleton of it was Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity, right? That was the skeleton. But then as other European immigrants came, they opted into it. And they chose oftentimes to anglicize their names and change and assimilate into white culture, right? Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, and to participate in this identity of whiteness, often severing themselves from heritage, culture, and again, even sometimes last names, right? So that they could fit in and assimilate and move and then participate and benefit from the value of whiteness, of being marked as a white body in society. So there was a historical choice that sometimes we don't always acknowledge. And then it forces us to think that, what does it mean then to choose to resist embracing whiteness, right? Now, of course, look, it's complicated because to be white it's two things, right? For any racialized person, there's how you identify yourself and then how others identify you, right? It's both ends. So sometimes people have some really quick, easy, oh, well, I'm not white anymore then, and that's it, right? And that's nice, but it doesn't work that simple. But at the same time, there is a way in which we can choose to not align ourselves with those who are powerful, with the dominant society. Everybody had a choice at different points as they came to this country who they wanted to identify with. That's really what it's about, who they wanted to identify with. And I think that we as Christians in the church need to really be thinking carefully about who and how we identify in the world. How we move in the world. Who are we in solidarity with? Who do we struggle alongside of? You think about Philippians 2, 5 through 11, right? Where we see that Jesus didn't take advantage of his divinity. He didn't take advantage of it. And he said he emptied himself. And it's interesting, so it says he emptied himself, and there's like two kind of statements there. On one hand, there's this idea that, he emptied himself into the form of humanity, right? It's kind of a universal statement that Jesus, in some ways, there's something about Jesus and how he came that he has come for all of humanity, he represents all of humanity, is trying to save all of humanity. And at the same time, it also says that he came in the form of the doulos, the slave, the most vulnerable in society. There's a kind of particularity to that we need to take seriously, right? That Jesus came, yes, for all, and yet in a particular way, identifying with and living the experience of those who are vulnerable in society. And I think, certainly, probably more than anywhere else in society, we've had the silly debates about, all lives matter, Black lives matter, and all this stuff. And we can't even make the simple realization that, yes, there is a universal significance for all of us as it relates to Jesus and the person of Jesus. And yet that always comes through the particularity of how he came, his incarnation itself, right? And so Jesus doesn't come as a centurion, but he does engage the centurion, right? He doesn't come as Caesar now, and Caesar never gets to meet him, but Caesar could have renounced and walked away and followed Jesus too, just like anybody else. And so there's a universal significance to that, but it comes through the particularity of this poor Jewish man who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And I think we've got to take that seriously as we think about our own identifications, our own solidarities, our own commitments, our own struggles in our day-to-day lives, if we are going to begin to confront the system of white supremacy in our society today. I'm thinking about the ways in which white supremacy shapes not only how we are seen, but how we see others. There's ways in which white supremacy is about seeing and being seen in the world, in a way in which it distorts and diseases our vision, our capacity to see the imago Dei, the dignity that is inherent in human beings because of the racial vision, the racial gazes that we've inherited in our society. I think about Mike Brown. And I remember the officer who said he looked like a demon coming towards me. And I wonder what would have happened had he been able to see the image of God, that this was a child of God before he shot him. I think about Tamir Rice, right? 12-year-old, 2 seconds. Shot him in 2 seconds, said he looked like a grown adult. What would have happened if he was able to see the image of God in Tamir Rice? Think about Renisha McBride. Renisha McBride got into an accident, needed help, looking for a good Samaritan, knocked on the door of a man. While the door was still closed and locked, he pulled out his gun and shot her in the head. And I wonder what would have happened if he could have seen the image of God in Renisha McBride. White supremacy distorts our vision, our capacity to see each other's humanity, to share life with one another. And then certainly for the church, then it distorts our understanding of our own faithfulness to Jesus Christ, to follow after him, the Jesus that was just clinging to those who were the least, the last, and lost in society, right? Who was constantly finding himself in the edges and the cracks and the margins of society. This Jesus that, again, who he was given a state-sanctioned execution, run through an unfair trial, brutalized, right? That story sounds familiar. And I think that if we are going to begin to think about how we can not only talk about white supremacy, but actually confront and challenge it, we're going to have to start taking seriously following Jesus. And we're going to have to not only take seriously following Jesus, but we're going to have to rethink our Christian formation itself. The same one that, again, my peers had them clinging to their American exceptionalism and their white identity, right? Because it was their Christianity was so blended in that they couldn't separate the one from the other, that we too need to then begin to wrestle with how we are being formed in the world, the kind of people that we're becoming, what socializes us, the kind of gazes on our eyes that help us see and not see, and then the ways that we navigate this system, right, this racial system that is designed, it's structured intentionally to harm some and benefit others, to destroy and to kill, and to prop up and to plunder. And so my hope, my challenge is that we can all be faithful in confronting the white supremacy as followers of Jesus, because he has provided for us the delivering path out of these problems. He's provided the grace that we can participate in a different kind of life, that we don't have to be bound by these patterns that have destroyed not only our lives, but our society, and in many ways, globally, has had huge impact. So thank you, and I believe we're going to open up for some conversation. I wanted to make sure I left some room for some Q&A. So we just want to open up and have a conversation together. So any questions that you have, please. We'll start up in the back. Go ahead.
You talked about power dynamics of race.
Yeah.
I was wondering, seeming to imply that white has power, that comes with the race. I was wondering, is that a power which needs to be used responsibly or should be rejected?
That's a great question. Yeah. That's a really great question. I've been thinking a lot about, and so one of the things you'll probably pick up is, well, maybe you will or won't, but I hardly use the language white privilege, because I've actually begun to see that it has been a limited framework for helping people process where to go. Sometimes it has helped some people kind of awaken, but it hasn't helped people kind of navigate what to do with power. I remember one particular time, I was watching a video of, he's a black scholar, probably a bit more conservative than I am maybe, but he was talking to a mostly white audience, and he was talking about white privilege, and so he tells this story of some friends of his who went overseas, some white friends. They went overseas, they were in Africa somewhere, and there was some kind of injustice going on, and they walked into the room, and all the Africans stood up straight. And so they were able to get in there, and they were able to make some changes and get things in place. And so he used that as a good example. He said, look, see, white people, you need to go and use your white privilege for good. And I was like, ooh, that don't sound right. This don't sound right. And so the problem is, for me, is when we make that argument, what stays in place, right? So now all of a sudden, right, he's not going over there. They're not colonizing. This is not conquest. This is not slavery. They're not setting up Jim Crow systems. They're not lynching anybody. But you know what stays in place in that whole thing? Racial hierarchy, right? Racial hierarchy does not get dismantled. And so there's still that in place, and that's the terms in which people are supposed to engage. It's just supposed to be benign racial hierarchy, right? And so I think that that we need frameworks for thinking about it. There's limited frameworks that I think that are out there right now that address that question fully. This is the one thing that I've been thinking about, and that's so in the early, this is little known, but many early African Christians, enslaved Africans, actually had inherited, because the dominant image was that Jesus was white. So many of them actually inherited a white Jesus. But they inherited, so if you listen to like some of the narratives, it was a little white man. Jesus was a little white man. And he's kind of like moving around, a little white man. And of course now to us that might sound kind of strange, like, all right, what does that mean? But that he was a little white man in the African tradition, his size actually meant something, because you think about, like, in America, Briar Rabbit stories and things like that, these smaller figures that kind of outwitted and outsmarted these bigger, greater opponents, right? And so they were able to kind of maneuver and outwit and trick, basically, these figures. And so there's this trickster kind of tradition in the African tradition that kind of uses these small figures, small animals to kind of outwit larger opponents. And that's the way that they were kind of articulating Jesus. Jesus was this white man, little white man, who was able to pass, and at the same time, he was kind of going behind their backs, and he was really he was a co-sufferer with these enslaved folks, right? And he was a friend in hard times. He was really ultimately in solidarity with them as he was this white man, right? And I think what is interesting, not that we are trying to necessarily imitate that exact, but there's something about the complexity, the both ends, right, of owning whiteness, but not necessarily, I don't think the language using it for good is probably not but how do we use it to subvert it, right? Because we don't want to keep the racial hierarchy in its place. So, you think about, so slavery, so we were able to, which is in and of itself a miracle, right? That people were able to imagine a world without slavery. We can take that for granted now, but that's a big deal. But they didn't get to the root of things, which was white supremacy. So that just morphed into something else, right? Jim Crow and black codes and convict leasings and all kinds of other stuff, and still a white supremacist system in play. And then we ended that, and now we have, mass incarceration and all the kind of stuff that's going on in our society. And we're trying to tackle these issues, but we're still sometimes missing the root of things, which is the white supremacy itself. So I think for us, such a great question is, how do we both acknowledge that, people cannot change how people perceive us, right? But we can identify and align with people who are struggling to resist these systems that are in place. And so you can do both at the same time. Own that you are seen as a white person, that you navigate and move in society as a white person, and at the same time that you're resisting it, that you're undermining it, that you're subverting it, and that you live in that tension. So it's messy. There's no clean answers to that. It's messy, but I think it's a better pathway forward than the too clean, but I think uglier offer of use your white privilege for good. I think that's short-sighted. And some people take that in different directions. Some people can have some common sense and do some good stuff with other people. Like, yeah, I'm gonna. So 400 years of white supremacy where white people ruled and controlled everything, and now what do I get to do? I get to rule and control everything again, right? And so I think that is not helpful, and I think we need to think more complex. And it's messy. There's no clean answers, and that's where we need to yield ourselves to God and discern in hard moments and contexts how to try to be best as faithful as possible in those unique situations, which no situation is exactly the same. But thank you, great question. I think you had next question. Yeah.
You used the term earlier, post-civil rights. I'm just wondering concern sometimes that we think of it as a three-ring circus, and this describes my fundamentalist Christian upbringing perfectly.
Yeah.
Day one, Rosa Parks. Day two, Martin Luther King. Day three were post-slavery.
Yeah.
And can you expand on, what you mean by that? Where are we at post-civil rights? Are we post-civil rights?
Yeah, I mean, and I use that term loosely in terms of just how it gets historically marked more than, so I would say that there's on one hand a continuous freedom struggle that's from the moment 1619 when Africans were brought over till the present day. There's been a seamless, non-stopped freedom struggle, right? And so these historical markers, if you just say something like the civil rights era, it's an artificial category that we've kind of just assumed and participated in. But to talk about a particular time period is more what I'm interested in, that there's that particular time period where the black church in particular and nonviolence movements in particular were having a huge impact on challenging, Jim Crow and disenfranchisement for particularly black folks, but much broader than that as well. Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah, you go ahead.
What are some actual practical things that we could do to subvert and resist white supremacy other than just knowing that it's a reality?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so some of the things I suggest, is to join in with what is already happening, right? A lot of times there's really good work that's already happening. In fact, a lot of times, people want to create their own organizations and things like that. I know right now in the past I won't say that. A lot of times white people can feel like, oh, we need to do something. They just kind of recreate the wheel when there's already good work happening. And I think a lot of times, there's great opportunity for white people to learn how to follow people of color in the work and in the struggle. So identifying who's doing some of this good work and how can I join in and participate in that. And oftentimes, joining in the midst of struggle, it can be, so there's concerns today about the kind of superficial reconciliation, right? Where I think white people want, the kind of kumbaya moment where we just kind of feel good, but we don't necessarily do anything that's going to deconstruct and challenge systemic injustice. And so in joining in the struggle, you can build relationships and actually be participating in something that's actually doing some work. And so I think that'd be probably my starting point, is saying, identify who's doing that work. I would say this though, as it relates to the knowledge piece, I would not underestimate, as it relates to our ways of knowing and thinking and seeing, how significant that is when it comes to race and racism, how deeply we've been socialized, so that our very sense and orientation in the world is deeply compromised, I think, because of race and racism. So I would say that that needs to be an ongoing thing as well. One of the things I've noticed in my own class, classes, is that, I teach a first-year seminar called The Politics of Blackness. And my students, first they're kind of confused. Why are we doing all this historical stuff? They just want to get into Black Lives Matter conversations, right? Why are we doing all this history first? And then they walk through, and then I realized, they didn't know about sharecropping. They know about the convicts leasing systems and black codes. They were horrified when they saw white families with their kids posing in front of lynched pictures, right? They're horrified. They can't imagine. They're horrified by the things that the church did, right, to bolster and be complicit in these things. So, I think there's a lot of unlearning, because we have a narrative that we tell, and it can suck up. Even I say often, you look at how Dr. King is celebrated. He's been subsumed somehow. We made a way so that he gets manipulated into the American exceptionalist narrative. Instead of subverting it, he's July 4th and MLK Day, right? Celebrate America. And I think there's something problematic about our narratives. We don't remember what has gone on in this land. Native Americans, there was near genocide. We need to reorient ourselves. So I do think that is actually some serious work that we need to do. I think we're running out of time.
If you're wanting more, the good news is there's more. You get to move over to lunch. Let's give Drew a big hand. That was wonderful, and I also wanted to leave time to make sure that you can get a book outside, because I know some of you may have a class. So Drew will be outside. We'll all be outside at the book table if you want a book. Let me close us in a prayer. This is a Franciscan blessing that I think is appropriate after the wonderful things that our brother shared. So let me send us out with this benediction. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and the exploitation of people, so that you may wish for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, so that you can do what others claim can never be done. Amen. So join us at Baird Library for more conversation or outside to get a book. Thanks.